do you see any capacity for a cosmopolitan ethic to be brought together with a patriotic view, and if so, how?
Yeah. I'm sympathetic to the global justice argument. Don't get me wrong about that. I do think there's a real, genuine imperative for developed countries to take the lead here. However, there is a gap in terms of principles, moral psychology, and action. And I don't think that the pathway from cosmopolitan ethics to policy action exists, not at the moment. So where patriotism enters the equation is it addresses the moral psychology aspect of the problem. I think people are more willing to make sacrifices, change their lifestyles when they can be part of a story. I'm not sure if the global story is compelling enough. We need to add a new layer to the case for climate change. And that hopefully is where the patriotic narrative can enter the equation. It can provide a story that people can latch onto, and it can make more immediate and more real the imperative to change the way that we live and do things.
Peter, did you want to respond?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think Tim put it very well to say that it's a gap in the moral psychology and how you get to action. I mean, and I think what he said didn't really challenge the ethical arguments that I was putting forward. Now, so the question you can ask is firstly, well, is he right that we can't get there through cosmopolitan arguments? And I would have to agree that we haven't got there, and it's hard to know if we are going to get there. So certainly he's got a good point there about the difficulty. The second issue is, are we going to get there better through appealing to patriotism? And the issue there is partly is the argument one that actually works? That is it really true that it's in our patriotic national interest to move first, right? I think undoubtedly it's in our interest that there be a change, that global warming be slowed. But since you know, we just heard about how small we are in comparison to a nation like India, and even if we acknowledge that per capita we have far higher greenhouse gas emissions, still whatever we do is not going to make the crucial difference. So you need the kind of argument that Tim was hinting at, that we will somehow have an economic argument because we'll develop solar technology, we'll hold patents, we'll have exports, something like that, if we do this. And then that has to be strong enough to weigh against the threats to our energy-intensive industry that if we have a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme or whatever. And that seems to me pretty debatable. And you can be quite sure, of course, that those vested interests who are opposed to it will be arguing strongly against it being in our national interest to move first. So I'm not sure that we're going to win that argument coming out on the side of being the first mover. And if we don't, then of course the gap is still going to be there. We're not going to get the action that we need. So, you know, I'm not averse to Tim putting that argument. I think it's great to have both of those arguments running parallel, if you like, the cosmopolitan argument and the patriotic argument. But I'm not sure that the patriotic argument is necessarily got a better chance of getting us there than the cosmopolitan one.
Thanks, Peter. I want to take two more questions from my list, and then I'll throw it to the microphones. And this is a question particularly posed to Kartikeya from Sarah Masters, which is, can you comment on the tensions between the pressure on an ethical agenda for government within the context of a burgeoning middle class and consequent demand for resources and impact on climate change within India and China?
As I said, the middle class, which is really exposed to media, exposed to what's happening in the world, is the one group which is taking on lifestyles which are very similar in their carbon inefficiency as are seen elsewhere in the world. And the challenge is, how do you get them to define better development or prosperity, as was mentioned yesterday, in a way in which it is not imitative. And this is what I was saying. It is a major challenge because everything we do, I mentioned about education and going out to these people, but it dwarfs, I mean, the entire budget for environmental education is equal to 2 soap ads, and that's what it is. Okay, now if you go with an advertising firm and say, I want this message to be reached to everyone, what would it cost? And I'm sure that it will be a much higher figure. So we feel we are doing a lot, we are doing all these things, but the pressures on the other side are enormous. And to some extent, it's easier to reach people through children. It was surprising what happened in the case of smoking, where the children played a major role in getting parents to give up smoking as much as parents directly did it. And we are finding this happening in waste disposal, in water saving, in saving electricity and others. Children learn about something in school, they go home and they said, look, I think this is not the way to do it. Now that's very encouraging, I thought. If that phenomena happens, it is extremely encouraging. They have a different media mix because they get more information from schools than necessarily from advertising and reach it. But the aspiration issue, I think, is a global one. I do not think in a communication world where people travel, people see the same things, that they can have very different aspirations.
Thanks, Kartikeya. I don't know if any of the others, if Tim or Peter wants to comment, because I've got another question here from Carol and Alan. And in reading the question, I was very much reminded of the insight from you, Kartikeya, in which you said, you know, we will solve this problem. It's just a question of how do we get there. And it reminded me very much of an insight from a very senior public servant that I used to work with, is that in London, he used to say to me, the point is, there's no-cost option in how you respond to this problem. It's just where do you want to bear your cost? Do you want that cost to be potentially catastrophic down the line, or do you want to bear the cost now in a reasoned and informed way? It also reminded me of Tim Jackson the other night, talking about the great temptation just to disconnect, to find your patch of land, your nice green slope, and just say, this is all too hard, I'm going to try and live as ethical a life as I can, and not engage. And Carol's question is, if those in positions of elected leadership continue to fail to act in the broader public interest, at what point does it become unethical to continue to accept such leadership? And have we passed that point? I think I'll go... Tim, Peter, and then Kartikeya. Tim.
Thank you to Sarah. Sarah, wasn't it? Carol, sorry, Carol, for the question. Well, look, obviously there is a disjunction between saying that that climate change is the greatest moral challenge of our time and then doing nothing about climate change. In that sense, there is clearly a failure of leadership. It strikes me that Kevin Rudd has been very happy to embrace nation building as a language when it applies to refurbishing schools and when it involves images of hard hats on TV, but hasn't been prepared to show courage when nation building has to be tackled in terms of infrastructure and reform. So if there has been a failure of leadership, it has really concerned political courage and conviction. Now, is it unethical for us to continue supporting leadership of that kind when we've given it endorsement in the past? Well, I think disapprobation has been expressed very clearly to Rudd Labor through opinion polls. One hopes as a progressive, in my case, that Rudd Labor can turn a corner. I don't know if that's going to happen, but you know, there is clearly here a failure of leadership.
Thanks, Tim. I would just say I have no idea whether Carol Ann actually is Australian. She may well be French or English and may well be alluding to other politicians in other jurisdictions. But either way. Peter.
Well, let's assume at least that Carol lives in a democratic nation, because I think that is relevant. Because I was going to say, what does it mean to say not to accept their leadership? Obviously, I think if there has been a failure on the great moral challenge of our age, and if there are other possible candidates you can vote for who make a plausible case for thinking that they will do more, then you should vote for those who will do more. And I think in Australia, I don't know what that laughter was suggesting, that there aren't any options. I do think that the Greens are a clear option here, and I think it's not surprising that Green support has surged. So in that sense, yes, you shouldn't accept it. But if you meant something more, then the question is, what did you mean? Did you mean, find your green field, as Nick was suggesting, and just drop out of politics at all? That's not going to help save the world, obviously. Did you mean start a violent revolution so that we get rid of the leadership? I doubt that that's really going to work and achieve the results you want either. So I don't think there's any option if you have some sort of democratic or quasi-democratic process to look for the best candidates and give them all your support, given that this is such a crucial issue.
At that point, I should just do a little public information thing for our politics session, which is going to conclude the Deakin's Lecture Series, where we're going to hear from the current Climate Change Minister in Tasmania, who happens to be a member of the Greens Party, together with Malcolm Turnbull and others who are on your little yellow booklets, or indeed outside. But Kartikeya, would you like to reflect on the question from your perspective?
My feeling is that democracy and the way we consult people needs to change. I think when you elect political leadership, it's on a very broad canvas, and it's based on what he said, hope that these people will make the right decisions. It was okay in a time when there was no way of consulting to say that I led the ship off, and for 5 years I will not be able to interact with it or recall it or do anything else. But today that is not the case. Today we have electronic media which enables us to feel the pulse of a nation, to feel the pulse of your electorate and the stakeholders. These are multi-stakeholder complex decisions. We have been asked to do, recently we have just completed 2 and a third one has started this morning, consultations on complex political decisions. The latest one being Monsanto wanting to introduce biotechnology eggplant, brinjal, into India. And this was passed, and we had this discussion. In fact, this was a consultation process over 40 days. We had 8,000 people visited, very big passions. We have 2,500 varieties of brinjal, eggplant in India. And as a result of that, the government changed its policy and put it on hold. Now, this is possible. Today we have in India, for instance, 400 million cell phones. It is possible to consult people. It's possible to consult people. We are trying to convert those cell phones into an environmental a green line, if you like, and put up a back office. This will probably happen in the next 2 months, to say that anyone who sees something which breaks a single environmental law can phone in, and you will process it and do something about that data. Now, can you imagine the power of that? It was just not possible 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So I think democracy has tools today which it is not using. And I think those tools need to be activated, including whatever I have followed of the debate recently on the mining one. It would be wonderful to have people participating in it, rather than it seem like either I'm for it or against it. But I think there are lots of nuances to something like that.
Thank you, Kartikeya. The young woman's been at the back, has been waiting very patiently. If you could say your name.
Hello, my name's Nicole. I have a question on education. Seeing as countries like Australia and India both need to take quite different paths in their journey towards sustainability, do you think there needs to be a different focus or emphasis on environmental education in both developed and less developed countries? For example, could children in Australia be taught in such a way that they can address the issue more immediately and have a greater influence on their parents? Whereas for children in India, would the focus be less on immediate change, but the change they could make over their lifetime?
Thank you very much for that very clear question. I've been told that occasionally I'm too harsh on the audience, so I'm going to be harsh on the platform. I'd like very quick responses from each of you.
I think you're the expert.
I think the basic methodology of engaging children is not different. You want them to apply themselves to a problem, you want them to do critical thinking, but the solutions which they come out with will be completely different in different contexts. They'll be different even in different parts of Australia, let alone between Australia and India. And I think when people see how people in different parts of the world deal with a similar problem, if you have water shortage in Sydney, or if you have water shortage in Mumbai or somewhere else in India, what are the options which people have applied? It enriches them, it opens up their minds. I think the whole question of the national versus cosmopolitan, it goes back to the think globally, act locally question which was raised earlier. It goes back to saying that is there really a difference? That solutions are local and people need to apply themselves. So I don't see it as, I see it as a strength.
Well, I mean, I agree. I don't have a lot to say on this topic. I think you do have to educate people in the specific situation that they are. And I do think it's very important to obviously get children thinking about this and just get children to make the case that to their parents that they want the world preserved so it's okay for them when they're 50 years old. I mean, that's the kind of closest we can get to a real concern for the future generations actually being represented directly to us.
Tim, quick response?
Yeah, it's important to encourage a certain literacy about the environment and getting future citizens to understand how the environment links up with the economy and with history as well. I'd be an advocate for seeing a great emphasis in civics education on some environmental issues and integrating the environment that way and getting future citizens to see acting on the environment as a civic responsibility, which was something that Kartikeya mentioned when he said the Indian Constitution actually enshrines that as a responsibility.
My name is Leon, before professor, philosopher and ethic, and thank you so much for organizing that. And I tell everybody hello, and I wish everybody healthy and happy, but this is not enough. We need to continue more. And thank you for Professor Peter and for Professor Tim here. I want to ask you not one make a statement because I need everybody have chance question. My question is like that. How can we bring together the great thinker to help us live a more meaningful life and peaceful life to create better world?
Thank you very much. That's clear. We should be able to resolve that one in a single sentence. Fellow at the back.
Hi, how's it going? I've just got a really quick question regarding the patriotic versus cosmopolitan argument, which was really, wouldn't the patriotic argument put us straight into competition with our direct neighbours such as Indonesia, China and India, who could then just opt out of trading carbon for an immediate short-term economic gain? This appears to be an easy defeat of the patriotic argument.
Thank you. I think it's quite an ask, but if we could cover the yellow question and the question at the back in a single response from each of you, going from your right of the stage to the left of the stage. Tim.
Question one, great thinkers, how do we utilize them, if I've understood the question correctly, with a lot of hard work. The second question, I didn't quite catch the gist of it because of the audio. I presume it was about how we can reconcile the patriotic argument if other countries utilize the argument as well, and then you get a patriotic kind of escalation of sorts. Well, look, that's that's part of that's part of the potential risk of running the argument, I suppose. The context in which I run the patriotic argument is getting developed countries such as Australia to take more decisive action. And I think there is a real nation-building story that can be told in Australia, and that can be part of a comprehensive reform agenda. You know, I think other countries can use nation-building narratives too. I don't think you can get rid of conflicting national interests, though, regardless of whichever story you use. And that will be the challenge, reconciling different national stories and agendas.
Kartikeya?
I'll answer the second one. The patriotic argument put in the current global context in the climate change discussion really cannot come to a different conclusion because there is no escape. The globe has, it's one globe, whatever we do, we are in it together. And therefore, patriotism can only be a way of motivating it. When the British organized the Indian Army, they organized it around different linguistic groups. And there was the question whether this would be divisive or whether it would bring people together. And people felt that it would not be divisive. They would still feel that we are fighting for India, but it is easier for us to say that we are Victoria people, or we are New South Wales people, and we are doing our best for a larger cause. And therefore, if patriotism is defined as a way in which we see ourselves as Australians doing something really wonderful for the world, I think then the two match. If we somehow see it as going in opposite ways, then there is a problem. And I think we just can't afford it. I mean, it's not even possible to leave this planet. So I think the reality of the planet is so clear today that it's only a question of how soon we'll realize it. This is the point I was trying to make. It's not a question of whether we'll realize it, it's there.
Thank you. So on the first question, I think is a very appropriate one in this series, because what we are doing is trying to get people thinking about one of the most critical issues of our age and inviting the public in to take part in the discussion. So we are trying to get thinkers, anyway, I'm not going to say we're great thinkers, but thinkers at least, to talk about how we can have better and happier lives, not just now, but in the long run. And I think that's what the Deakin lectures are doing. It's what the Wheeler Centre is also doing in trying to promote more intellectual debate in our community. And I think that's a start, but it's a huge issue, obviously, and there's no one simple answer to that question. I think the question about sort of competition between nations and how the patriotic argument works does really make the point that we can run the patriotic argument here in Australia if we like and if we think it's going to be effective. Great. But we need the cosmopolitan argument as well, because it's certainly not going to be the case for every nation that the patriotic argument is going to point in the same direction. It's just too optimistic to think that it's going to be the same. You mentioned Indonesia, developing countries which see their need for development as greater. I mentioned Canada maybe, or Russia, which might see it as not that bad for them if climate change goes a bit, we get 2 degrees warmer. So I think we need to have both of these arguments going at a minimum.
Tim, in moving or shifting nation building from its historic association with hard hats and Australia as a limitless resource, do white settler Australians that are immigrants, have something to learn from the Aborigines, from the Indigenous Australians' relationship to land, water, air? And by that I mean being custodians of the land, and therefore is the process of reconciliation, which became a little bit of a cliche and stalled, does that have something to contribute to a new patriotism of conservation and a new attitude to the air as a resource?
I'm sorry, I should have asked for your name so that Tim can respond in a polite way.
Tony Moore, Monash University.
Thanks, Tony. Okay. Gentleman at the back with the blue hat.
Bruce McNeil. In the last week, we've had a major initiative from some very benevolent organisation in Norway offering $10 million, it's roughly, I think it's around $10 million, to buy large tracts of the Indonesian rainforest. Within days of that being announced, barrage of criticism from various NGOs and local interest groups came forward. So obviously the thing's going to be mired in ethical dilemmas. So often this happens that those kind of initiatives which, in terms of kind of changing the agenda changing, which virtually would be in terms of Indonesian rainforests because it's such an important issue. But so often these things get caught and mired in ethical dilemmas of that type, and therefore drag on for years and years. I'm just wondering if has there been any major initiative to try and create guidelines, or is it an issue that's up in meetings like Copenhagen and Kyoto, so on?
Thank you. I think that question essentially was saying, you know, are we actually, what hope have we to move towards more of a global ethic in response to this global problem, if I've done the question justice. Tim, if you want to comment on the point in relation to patriotism and Aboriginality, and then if we can go across the stage.
I'll be very brief. Mike Holm, in his book Why We Disagree About Climate Change, poses the question, why shouldn't we think of climate change in the following terms? Instead of asking what we can do for climate change, ask what climate change can do for us. I think that's a very important lesson. We can use climate change to reframe a lot of debates and to really breathe life into a lot of conversations. Aboriginal reconciliation is certainly one of them.
Kartikeya?
This whole question of buying into things, we do it in a nice activity in a school, where we say that we will allow you to trade in your marks, in your final exam marks. And people are appalled a bit and they see what happens. And then children themselves come and ask the ethical question that how come he can get a distinction in science when in fact he did nothing, he knows nothing, just because he bought it off others who did well. And it brings you into the same discussion as the climate change international one, but through a way in which everyone can understand. You should try it if you have children who try, just try it. And the point is that if you're doing everything else and you are buying into something up to a point, I think it's a possible solution. But if you say that you don't need to change yourself, you have the money power, and you can just buy the good things and get more marks, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in the classroom and it doesn't work in the world. So I think those are the fears which people have with all these schemes saying that I am buying something.
Peter?
Well, I don't entirely agree with that comparison, of course, because if you're buying something, you have to put resources into it. And that is a way of putting a price on your own carbon emissions. You say, because our carbon emissions are so high, we have to buy a lot of quota from India or wherever. If our carbon emissions were lower, we wouldn't have to buy so much. So that's a way in which we see the cost of carbon. But I think the question was more about, well, are there ethical guidelines for some of these dilemmas that we have, like setting aside rainforest and then maybe conflicts with local communities and the larger, all of these other issues. And I think the answer has to be that, well, there are so many specific issues. Yes, we need to think about each of them, but we certainly don't have one comprehensive set of guidelines that enables us to deal with them. They're too complex. And we are going to obviously have problems in conflict with a lot of things. We have that here too. We have proposals to put up a wind farm down on the coast, and then somebody says, well, but when you put up wind farms, birds hit the wind farms and you kill some birds. You know, we do have to just do trade-offs. I'm as much against killing birds as anyone, I think, but you know, I accept that in order to reduce our carbon footprint, we maybe have to be prepared to kill some birds anyway. It's tough, you know, that's the kind of world we live in. There are no things that we can do without a cost for ourselves as well as for the non-human species. But again, for the non-human animals as well, if we don't do something about climate change, the cost will be worse still.
Thanks, Peter. The eldest brother in the film The Castle often looked through the trading post and looked at the price of things like jousting sticks. And he was described as an ideas man. He's an ideas man. That's what he is. And when Tim and I worked on who we would have through the Deacon's Lecture series, Tim was really clear we don't want ideas men, what we want are practitioners. But tonight we've had two ideas men, one a younger one with a lot of hair, one an older one with slightly less, and in the middle we've had a practitioner who's actually doing things today, and we've heard about those. And I think it's been a terrific session, but I'm not sure if Tim is an ideas man or a practitioner, but if he did either of them, he'd do it brilliantly, and I pass over to the curator, Tim Flannery.
Well, my job at the end of sessions is to summarise the most important, the essential things that have been drawn out through the various sessions. This evening it's really difficult for me because we have touched on one of the most profound areas that the climate problem presents us with. But I'd just like to reflect briefly on Peter Singer's view that we know that what we are doing is unethical, profoundly unethical. And if you actually know that, issues of economics, of relative competitiveness and so forth, fundamentally become irrelevant because you are compelled to act. We are compelled to act in an ethical way. And I don't know quite how we make people face the unethical way that we as a nation are behaving. Clearly at the basis of it all, or at the basis of much of it, is coal. We are burning coal to generate electricity in a very unethical way. And one of the questions we had from the audience was about how do we respond to the moral failure of leadership, because now we don't have a mechanism, a government mechanism, to start reducing that unethical behaviour. When I was growing up and people were faced with an unethical decision by a government, such as damming the Gordon River or logging old-growth forests, civil disobedience was a critically important element in stopping those decisions going ahead. But for some reason or other, the climate challenge has not inspired young people to say in a very clear way that what we are doing is simply wrong. I do believe that we have touched on a very fundamental point this evening, not an easy one to resolve. But I hope that as you go away, you won't just let the thoughts that have come into your minds this evening just drift off, that you'll revisit them time to time, trying to make more sense of them, trying to understand what your personal moral responsibility is in all of this. Because it's only through that we'll get the action we need. Could I thank a fantastic panel for a marvellous job? I just think they've been wonderful. Thank you. And our moderator.